Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure today to introduce Francesca Tombari, who will be telling us about decomposing simplicial complexes without losing pieces.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm very glad to be here today and very thankful to Henry and Facundo for giving me the opportunity to present this work in this wonderful seminar series. This is a talk based on an article that was published this year, and this was it is a joint work with Wojciech Chachólski, Alvin, and Martina Scolamiero, so part of the TDA group at KTH. So the title contains almost contains everything I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about simplicial complexes in general, even though the examples that I'm going to show you are Vietoris-Rips complexes. And I'm going to talk about decompositions. What kind of decompositions, it will be clear in one or two slides. And it will be hopefully also clear why Vietoris-Rips complexes are good examples for this type of decompositions, and they're kind of natural ones as well. And hopefully we might also get a sense of what I meant without losing pieces. All right. So let me start with an example. Consider these 9 points on the circle labeled as X, Y, and A, numbered from 1 to 3. And you will see in 1 second why I gave these names to these points. But this is not only a bunch of points on the circle, this is actually a metric space. We consider a distance of 1 for every couple of adjacent pairs. And I want to consider the Vietoris-Rips complex of this metric space at scale 3. This is not a particularly new example. As you might know, indeed, the Vietoris-Rips complex of the circle has been studied, particularly in this paper that I referred here by Henry and Michal Adamaszek. And so I'm not presenting this example because it's particularly new or unknown, but I want to explain you how to retrieve the homotopy type of this space using decomposition techniques that we developed in this paper. Okay, so also, why did I choose this example? Because it's not that trivial. So it looked like something, it looked like this simplicial complex. So unless you've worked with it or unless you have particularly good geometric intuition, you might not know by eye what homotopy type does this simplicial complex have. Also because I'm hiding a little bit of information, in particular, the fact that Vietoris-Rips complexes are clique complexes. So I drew the one skeletonate. So whenever I draw the boundary of a triangle, for example, I actually mean the triangle to be filled in. So I consider the entire 2 simplex. And the same when I draw a tetrahedron. So actually the one skeleton of a tetrahedron, I mean it to be filled in. So I consider the entire three simplex. All right, and so I want to attack this problem by considering a decomposition of this space Z. How? So, and here the reason why I chose these letters to label the points of the circle. So I take 2 subsets, 2 submetric spaces of Z called X and Y, where X contains all the points labeled with X and A's, and Y contains all the points labeled with Y's and A's. and A, of course, will be the intersection then. And this is, for example, the set X. So it contains these 6 points. Since I'm interested in understanding what's the homotopy type of the Vietoris-Rips at scale 3, I will consider then the Vietoris-Rips of X, for example, so of one piece at the same scale 3. If I didn't do an awful, awful picture, it might be even clear by eye that this thing that I obtained is homotopically equivalent to S2. You may indeed see that this is an S1 and it is a suspension, and this total simplicial complex is just a suspension of this S1, so S2. Cool. Analogously, we see that also Y has the same Vietoris-Rips complex at scale 3. So it also is homotopically equivalent to S2. So what do we have so far? We have two submetric spaces of Z, X and Y, whose Vietoris-Rips complex is homotopically equivalent to S2. And their union includes into the Vietoris-Rips complex of Z. Actually here, I didn't write union, I wrote wedge. That's because we are, the Vietoris-Rips complex of the intersection A is a triangle, which is meant again to be filled in. And so these two pieces are gluing into something contractible. And so it's going to be a wedge, right? Cool. All right, so we have this inclusion. However, we cannot yet conclude that then the homotopy type of the Vietoris-Rips complex of Z at scale 3 is homotopically equivalent to the wedge of two copies of the two-sphere. Indeed, this map might not be a homotopy equivalence, this inclusion map. But I wonder, okay, let's see if it actually is. So I claim that the answer to this kind of problem is strongly dependent on these sets here that I define. And those are, so let's fix a simplex sigma in the Vietoris-Rips complex of Z. We consider all the subsets of A, the intersection of the two sets, submetric spaces, that together with the points of sigma form a set of points of diameter less or equal than 3, which is nothing else but saying that mu together with sigma form a collection of vertices of a simplex in that Vietoris-Rips complex. And I refer to this kind of these sets as obstruction complexes, each one associated to a simplex in sigma in the Vietoris-Rips of Z, and they are indeed simplicial complexes. Visually, if this is your sigma in the Vietoris-Rips complex, this obstruction complex associated to sigma is going to be something that lives indeed in the intersection of the two pieces covering the space. Okay, but this is only for this particular case. But before I anticipated that actually we developed these ideas for general simplicial complexes. And indeed, if you think about the things that I told you, there was nothing really dependent on the fact that we were working with a metric space or with a metric complex. But these kind of questions can arise for a general simplicial complex. So let me give you the setting, the formulation of the problem for a general simplicial complex. call it K, and call K0 the collection of its vertices. Then, as we've done before, we take a covering by two sets X and Y of the collection of vertices of K. And we may restrict K to these subsets of points, X and Y. In this way, we obtain two subcomplexes of K. And if we take the union, this is still a subcomplex of K, which includes, and then we can conclude, we have this inclusion map. You will hear me refer to this union of restricted K as the data-driven decomposition of K. Before I sloppily mentioned that this map for the Vietoris-Rips complex case, and also in this case, is not generally a homotopy equivalence. And indeed, this is a simple example that shows it. So if you have a square, K, and you take the decomposition of the vertices given by these two vertices on the left and these two on the right, then you restrict K to these subspaces, and this is what you obtain. So these two one simplices. So they have different H0 and different H1. So definitely they have different homotopy type. So I want to conclude this very long introduction by saying that, by summarizing it into a question, which is, can we measure the difference of K and its data-driven decomposition? And the difference, I mean, in their homotopy type, and most of all, what do I mean with measure? Okay, so this is the setting. And as I said before, this question is strongly dependent on what I called before obstruction complexes. I defined it before for the Vietoris-Rips complex of that particular space, but this is a general definition that you can have once you fix a decomposition of K based on the vertices, and you fix a simplex in K. Again, to have a visual intuition of this, consider this simplicial complex and consider sigma as a simplex in it. So this sigma, I don't know if it is clear from the picture, but it's just this edge, V0, V1. Well, A0 and A1 are, for example, two zero simplices in the obstruction complex of sigma. Indeed, for example, if you A0 together with V0 and V1 form a two simplex in sigma. And the same for A1. However, the one simplex A0, A1 is not part of the obstruction complex of sigma. Indeed, there is no tetrahedron A0, A1, V0, V1 in the simplicial complex. Okay, so let me direct towards the main theorem that I want to show you. But before, we need one more definition, which is this P, which is a subposet of K, defined as the collection of simplices in K, such that sigma has vertices entirely on X or entirely on Y, like this row in the picture, or if it has vertices both in X, in Y, then it also has to intersect A, like this sigma here. Equally important, actually, even more in this talk, because we're going to refer to to it more directly is the complement of P inside K, so K minus P. That is the collection of simplices in K that have both points, vertices in X, in Y, and do not intersect A, the intersection of capital X and capital Y, like this tau in the second picture. Okay, so now we are ready for the main theorem. That states the following. So imagine that you have a property C, or for the one of you that knows about it, a closed collection of simplicial sets. Then, and assume that for every sigma in this K minus P that we have just defined, the obstruction complex associated to such a sigma satisfies that property. Then the homotopy fibers of the inclusion map of the data-driven decomposition of K into K also satisfy that property. What does it mean? This might be a little bit obscure. That's why I'm going to explain, to tell you about two examples of property that we consider, or of closed collection that we consider. And those are actually the consequences in which the examples that I'm going to show you later are based. So it's particularly relevant for this talk. So consider contractibility has property. So that every sigma in this K minus P has contractible obstruction complex. Then the inclusion map of the data-driven decomposition of K into K is a weak equivalence or a homotopy equivalence. I'm using these words interchangeably. Another example is this one. So if you have that every sigma in K minus P has n connected obstruction complex, then the homotopy fibers of the inclusion are also n connected. And what does it mean? That this that this inclusion then induces an isomorphism on homotopy groups in degree up to n and a surjection in degree n plus 1. All right, there are possibly other consequences of this, if you consider other examples of closed collection. However, as I was mentioning, it's not that they are less important, it's just that the examples that I'm going to show are only related to having contractible or n-connected obstruction complexes. And they are easier to find example about also.
Sorry, Francesca.
Yes.
Could you remind us the relation between A and P?
A and P. So yes. No, how do I go back? Sorry, I don't know how to go back, but so maybe I can write P. There is this relation. P is the, is the collection of K's, of simplices in K, such that they are either entirely in X or entirely in Y, or they intersect A. Okay, so P contains simplices that might intersect A if they have also vertices in X minus A and Y minus A, basically.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so I moved forward without wanting it, but so there is one more result in this slide, which is basically a weakening of the hypothesis on this second consequence about n-connectedness of the obstruction complexes. So, which in particular says that in order to guarantee the n-connectedness of the homotopy fibers of the inclusion map, we don't need to look at all simplices in K minus P, as I said before, but we just need to check the obstruction complexes associated to simplices in the n+1 skeleton of K minus P. So let's say that we just want to check one connectedness, then we just have to look at the 2 skeleton of K minus P. So lower dimensional simplices. All right. I know this is a lot of content, written content for being a slide, but the next one is going to be more visual. Hopefully will give an intuition of what this theorem actually does. So let's go back to the 9 points on the circle example. I remind you the 2 submetric spaces covering Z, which is the total space. And I remind you that we had this intuition of this inclusion of the data-driven decomposition into the Vietoris-Rips of the total space Z. And we also had that the data-driven decomposition is homotopically equivalent to the wedge of 2 copies of the 2 spheres. All right, so we were here. But now the theorem that we've just seen says that in order to understand better this inclusion map, we have to look at obstruction complexes associated to simplices like this one in the picture, which is in K minus P, as I defined, because it has 1 vertex in X, 1 vertex in Y, and no vertices in the intersection A. So if we draw its obstruction complex, we see that it coincides with this 1 simplex A1, A2, which turns to be contractible. And this can actually be proved for every obstruction complex associated to such sigmas in K minus P, which meant for the previous theorem that then this map, this inclusion map, is a homotopy equivalence. So what we've done, basically, we had a simplicial complex of which we didn't know the homotopy type. We decompose it into 2 pieces that are more easily understandable. And then we checked the obstruction complexes, which turned to be contractible, which is what we needed to conclude that we actually have, that these 2 objects have the same homotopy type. All right. Now let's shift a little bit, because now we move to from the general case to the case of Vietoris-Rips complexes arising from distance spaces or pseudometric spaces. What does it change in this context? Well, the condition that we had on contractibility and connectedness, or whatever condition we had on obstruction complexes, here translates into conditions on the distance or on the pseudometric. And here is the result for a distance space, for example. Since it's not really a standard terminology, I refer to a distance space here as basically a pseudometric space without the triangular inequality required. So we have a distance space, we have a decomposition of it as we've done before. And again, A is the intersection of these 2 pieces, which is required to be non-empty. And also we need 2 conditions to hold. take one point x in x minus a, one point y in y minus a, and one point v in a. Like this, they would form a triangle. And we require that the distance from x to v and from y to v is smaller or equal than the distance from x and y. It is basically saying that x minus a and y minus a should be far enough, let's say. And if we were in the Euclidean space, then these conditions would just say that the angle formed by x, v, and y should be greater or equal than 60 degrees. The second condition says that the diameter of the intersection should be smaller than the distance from x to y. So the diameter is required to be small enough. Okay, so if those two conditions are satisfied, then the inclusion map of the union of the Vietoris-Rips complexes of the two pieces x and y is into the Vietoris-Rips complex of z at same scale is a weak equivalence, so it's homotopy equivalence. And this is true for every r. So these conditions allow us to not be independent from the parameter that we choose. Okay, so this was an example for a distance space, and the next one is about a particular type of pseudometric space that I'm going to define for you. So let's say that we have two metric spaces, so two with different metrics, but they coincide in the intersection, which is non-empty. Then we can define a distance from one point x in x and one point in y as this infimum here that over points in the intersection. So to measure the distance from x and y, we have to go through their intersection. And this is called, for this reason, a metric gluing. This is an example that we took from this paper by Wojciech and co-authors, in which they they study extensively the homotopy type of the Vietoris-Rips complexes of such spaces. What do we want to do with this example of pseudometric space is to see if we can use this decomposition that is intrinsically given by how this space is constructed in order to see if we can say something about the homotopy type of the Vietoris-Rips of the total space. Well, we need a condition in order to say something, an hypothesis that is the following one. Consider assume that for every vertex v in an edge sigma in the Vietoris-Rips complex of z minus p in the picture, such a v will be either x or y. If it happens that a and b are elements in the intersection such that AV and VB are simplices in the Vietoris-Rips complex, then twice their distance is required to be smaller or equal than the sum of the distance from A to V and V to B. So in other words, this is like a little bit more than the triangular inequality, since this would be the triangular inequality without the two, but we are asking a little bit more. And we refer to these conditions as the strong simplex assumption. If this condition holds, then what happened? That for any simplex in the Vietoris-Rips of Z minus P, such that either there is only one vertex in X or only one vertex in Y, then it happens that the obstruction complex associated to this, to such a sigma is contractible. What does it mean in terms of homotopy or homology groups? It means that the inclusion map induces an isomorphism on pi 0 and pi 1 and a surjection on pi 2. Why this happens? Because if you remember, this was in the slide with a lot of text. There was this theorem that said that in order to ensure n connectedness, so in this case, one connectedness of the homotopy fibers, we just need to ensure that the obstruction complexes of sigmas in the two skeleton are n-connected. And indeed, such two simplices in K minus P, so in Vietoris-Rips of Z minus P, has exactly this property that they have one vertex in X or one vertex in Y for how they are constructed. All right, so what I want to say next is I want to show you an example that tells you that the theorem that I just showed you is actually sharp in the sense that we cannot, with this condition, with this strong simplex assumption on a metric gluing, we cannot say more on the homotopy type, on the homotopy groups, sorry, that are higher than pi 2. And this is an example that should show it. So consider this metric space, which is a metric gluing. The picture is not precise. It's meant to give you an intuition of what's going on. So you have basically a solid line or no line, dependent on if the distance from 2 points is less or equal than 8. So like this is going to be less or equal than 8. And also the distance between these two is going to be less or equal than 8. And there is a dotted line to underline those distances that are equal than 9. Why this? Because we're interested in the Vietoris-Rips complex at scale 8. And it was a mess to try to draw all the lines. Okay, two things. This metric space is a metric gluing given by this X with points labeled with X and A, and this point Y, and this submetric space given by Y and A. And it also satisfies the strong simplex assumption. So this guarantees the fact that the obstruction complex is associated to such simplices. For example, this is a 2 simplex in the Vietoris-Rips of Z at scale 8, has a contractible obstruction complex. And indeed, in this case, it is A11. So a point is contractible. However, it doesn't guarantee anything on obstruction complexes associated to higher dimensional simplices in K minus P. So if you take this tetrahedron, that is also a simplex in Vietoris-Rips of Z minus P, we have no clue on, we actually know that the obstruction complex is empty for how we constructed this example. And so we have no information on, higher on the isomorphism, on the relationships between higher homotopy groups. And this is reflected by the actual homotopy type of the decomposition and of the total space. The decomposition is in fact contractible, and the Vietoris-Rips of Z is instead has the homotopy type of the three-sphere. So in particular,
this three-sphere, is it cross polytopal because you have all edges besides those four dotted?
Precisely. That's one way in which it can be seen. Yeah, thanks. That's important comment. And yeah, and this is reflected by their homotopy groups. Indeed, there is an isomorphism, a trivial isomorphism on pi0 and pi1, and a surjection on pi2, even though it's an isomorphism. And there is no surjection, no isomorphism on pi3. And remember that pi0, pi1, and pi2 were guaranteed by the theorem that we've seen, but nothing more is guaranteed. All right, I went a little bit over my time, and I have 1 or 2 slides prepared if you want to know more about the role of P and K minus P that might have appeared out of the blue a little bit. So if you want to know it, I'm happy to talk about it, but before I want to stop and take any other question if you have any. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Francesca. So before we get to questions, please briefly unmute yourself and let's applaud for the speaker.
Thanks.
And let's open it up for questions.
So I have a couple of questions.
Yes.
So the first one is sort of the obvious one, right? So if you cover your metric space with more than 2 sets, what happens? Is there like a spectral sequence kind of thing that one can do?
Precisely.
And I'll ask the second question after that.
Okay.
And Francesca, let me say, if you're not able to go backwards in your slides, if you stop sharing and reshare, maybe you'll be able to again. So it might be worth trying that if you think
okay,
well.
Thanks. I know that I can also go until the end, which is close, and then close it. But I will also use your technique if I cannot. Thanks. Yeah, but about the question, I was actually kind of prepared because I have no answer for the general case because it gets complicated and all the, so in the general case, in the case with 2 elements covering, we have just obstruction complexes that live in the intersection, but we have many different intersections. There are more things that comes into account. So the situation gets easily more complicated. But there is this case in which it's not hard to describe what happened, and it is a very special covering by n+1 sets. How is this given? Well, we can consider the vertices of K, and we take, let me do it for 3, a big intersection, A, and only one point that is outside the intersection for each set covering it. Is the picture kind of clear? So only one point outside each one. If this is the situation, then 2 things can happen. So if you have n+1 distant vertices of K, then it might happen that they form an n simplex in K, or they don't. If they don't, then it's easy because the data-driven decomposition is exactly the simplicial complex. More interesting is when these n+1 points form a simplex in K. In this case, the obstruction complex fits into a cofibration sequence like this one. And what does it mean? That then the homotopy type of the obstruction complex, of what did I say? Of the data-driven decomposition of K and of the nth suspension of the obstruction complex are related into in a long exact sequence. So in particular, we obtain a weak equivalence between the data-driven decomposition of K and K if, for example, the obstruction complex is contractible. So this is the only case that is included in the article for more than 2 subsets covering K0. Otherwise, as I mentioned before, we don't really have an answer because it got a little bit complicated.
So even for 3, it's for any 3, it's not decided yet?
No, exactly.
Oh, wow.
And then the second question, thank you for that, by the way. So the second question is, it has to do with the thing that you're comparing the gluing of the rips of the pieces to. What do I mean by that? So I would have guessed that if you took your metric space and you split into pieces, then the thing that you would like to do is to take the metric gluing of that and then take the Rips complex of the resulting metric gluing. And that would be the thing to compare the gluing of the 2 Rips complexes. Does that make sense, what I just said?
Well, that's the case of the metric gluing, but if you start with a space and you don't want to modify the metric, then...
Right, so yeah, so that's where my question is going. So my question is, do we know what the difference is or conditions to analyze the difference between the original metric space Z and then the metric gluing of X and Y?
I actually haven't thought about that. Well, I guess, okay, for sure they are not equal because you're modifying the metric. But I don't actually know.
Okay.
Yeah, I will think about that. Yeah.
More questions?
Maybe I can make a comment to the last Jose question. So of course these tools enable you to compare these 2 metric spaces, because the obstruction complex doesn't assume that the ambient complex is a metric gluing, right?
Correct.
At least you have tools to try to compare the obstruction complexes. There will be a factorization. Okay. So there's at least, and I don't know, one should have to go through examples and see how, whether these obstruction complexes, how different they are if you change the metric. Okay.
Yeah, so I guess the reason why I'm asking is because sort of, at least for topological inference, the Rips complex is sort of nice at small scales, which is what the gluing sort of feels like to me. That you take your metric space, you divide it into small sets, you take Rips complex on each one, and maybe the gluing feels more like the underlying space at small scales. So even if it is very different from the Rips complex of the metric space at large scales, perhaps that's not a bad thing. Maybe just the metric gluing is the better thing to do.
Sure.
Francesca, maybe I have a question, which is a little out there, but right. So I like the machinery that you're using, right, with these sequences and the obstruction complexes. And I'm curious if you have any speculation on whether this machinery could be applied in other contexts, like maybe products or quotients or other ways of combining metric spaces. So maybe one I have in mind is the following products. So you know, if you have two metric spaces and you take their you form their product, and the metric is now defined with the sup norm, then the Rips complex of the product is homotopy equivalent to the product of the Rips complexes. Okay, but if you use a different metric on the product, like the L1 way of combining metrics, then I don't think very much is known at all. So what I mean by this is like the distance between x, y, and x prime, y prime. You know, in the sup norm, it'd be the sup of the distances between x and x prime and y prime. But in the L1 norm, it'd be the sum, right? So even if you take like 2 points, right, you have the 2-point metric space. So then their L1 product is like this, the 4 vertices of a square, you know, and then take another product with 2 points, you get, you know, the vertices of a 3D cube and then a 4D cube, right? And I think those homotopy types are quite hard. So in any case, any speculation on analogs of obstruction complexes for other ways of combining metric spaces?
So I think that there is space for sure to think about it, because so since the machinery that we have developed is abstract for abstract simplicial complexes, then what did we do after that? We basically start playing around with conditions and trying to understand for which conditions on the metric we got those contract and connectedness, contractibility conditions that we got. So I'm positive in the sense that if one starts to play around with this, instead of trying to deal with understanding the homotopy type and having to compare these two, then you may just say, okay, these conditions easily give me the contractibility of obstruction complexes of one simplices, for example. So I don't know, I think it makes it kind of a step closer somehow. I don't know, that's my general thought.
Fantastic, thanks. Any last questions from folks? If not, well, thanks again, Francesca, and thanks you all for joining. So we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much.